It has been mentioned a few times over the last few days. Sweden outranks the rest of Europe in the European Innovation Scoreboard. The scoreboard helps countries assess the relative strength and weakness of their national innovation systems and identity, and challenges their needs that needs to be addressed. To help us make sense of this scoreboard and to navigate how to best use the ranking, I'd like to welcome Alexandr Hobza, who's head of unit, chief economist at the European Commission. Alexander, welcome. Talk to us about these rankings.
Good afternoon, and many thanks for the kind invitation and also the possibility to speak about the innovation performance of EU countries. But indeed, before I will go there, I would like to explain a little bit about our scoreboard, what it is, how it can be used, and also what are its limitations. So I've prepared a couple of slides. So now let me start with the scoreboard. The European Innovation Scoreboard has been around for some 20 years, so it's a product with a long history. It's quite popular. You've mentioned the references to the scoreboard, and it has quite a bit of impact. As you mentioned, it is a comparative assessment of where countries stay with their research and innovation performance. And it also helps them to assess their weaknesses and strengths. But here I have to stress, and then I'll get to it in a second, it is based on indicators, which means it has very powerful nature. It shows figures where countries stand vis-a-vis the EU average, where you can compare how they are doing. At the same time, once you're building on quantitative information, there are limitations. Indicators don't tell you everything, and if you want to have proper assessment of where countries stand, you obviously have to complement it with maybe more indicators, but also very importantly by qualitative information. Now, the innovation scoreboard, the European Innovation Scoreboard, doesn't come alone. In the European scoreboard, we're looking at countries in Europe, but also in neighborhood and then also main competitors in the world. But we also have a regional scoreboard, which covers around 240 regions and provides more nuanced picture. Obviously, this comes a little bit at cost because we do not have all the indicators that we have for the European Innovation Scoreboard, and that's why we have to rely on a narrower set of indicators. Now, just to give you a little bit overview of what we are talking about. So we are covering four main groups of aspects that somehow are representative of innovation performance of countries. Under these four main groups, we look at 12 dimensions, and overall we have 32 indicators. When I was talking about the regional scoreboard, there we're using only 26 indicators because information on the remaining ones is not comparable, for example, so we have to do with less. In these four main groups, we're looking at issues like framework conditions for companies to engage in innovative activities. And there we're looking at issues like human resource availability, of degree of digitalization. We look at investments, both in terms of support from countries, from governments, but also investments at the level of firms. We look at innovation activities, where we try to see how innovative companies are in terms of product innovations or business process innovations. A very important aspect is the linkages between different actors within the innovation ecosystems, but also on the production of innovation by looking at intellectual assets such as patents or trademarks. But last but not least, we are looking also at impacts, like how innovation is translating into employment, sales, or also what role environmental sustainability is playing. Now, here you see the main results of the 2022 European Innovation Survey or Scoreboard. Here we've split countries into four groups. This is done for better overview or understandability of the results. We have the best performers, which we call innovation leaders. We have strong innovators, moderate innovators, and emerging innovators. I've mentioned at the beginning already that countries are compared relatively to the EU average. So all these groups are defined in comparison to the EU average. And now what is quite striking about this graph is how countries are split also in geographical sense. So we see the best performers, innovation leaders and strong innovators in Northern Europe and in Central Europe. And you've mentioned it already, Sweden tops the ranking. And moderate innovators and emerging innovators are more concentrated in Southern Europe and also in Central and Eastern Europe. In this graph, you see more details for each and every country. And there you can see that in particular for emerging innovators and moderate innovators, there is still quite a lot of heterogeneity among countries. When you would ideally want those who are less performing in terms of innovation to perform well and then catch up with those who are on the top. Now that you can see whether this is the case or not from this graph, which shows the changes over time. And there we can see that the best performer in terms of improvements between 2015 and 2022 is Cyprus, followed by Estonia, Greece, Lithuania, Czech Republic, and I must say I do not see the small print. Well, and Finland, right? Now, when you look at the colors of these bars, which are associated with the performance groups, what you would like to see in this graph is to be the countries in red, in dark red, to be on the right. So those which have relatively lower levels of innovation performance to experience big improvements. Unfortunately, this is not the case. We see that the countries which are improving more are those from either stronger innovation groups or also the moderate innovators. But between the emerging innovators, we see quite big differences, and then they tend to be located more on the left of the graph. So this is something which is of concern, and that we would or we should address through policies. Now, I have mentioned at the beginning that we are looking not only at this aggregate performance in terms of innovation, but we look also at the different dimensions. And here you can see who are the leaders in terms of the different dimensions. And you can see quite a lot of heterogeneity in these results. So out of the 12 dimensions that we've covered, there is 11 different member states which are best performer in one of them. The only exception here is Sweden, which actually performs best in 2 dimensions, and then specifically human resources and also employment impacts. For all the other dimensions, we can see different leaders ranking from different groups of innovation performance. So we have a strong innovator, Luxembourg, which is providing very attractive research systems. We see Greece, which is a moderate innovator, but is quite well performing in terms of innovators. Right? We have Ireland, for example, which is ranking first in terms of sales impacts. So this is a positive message. Now, I've mentioned at the beginning, we do not cover only European or the European Union countries, but also we look at the neighborhood and also global competitors. This is obviously very important when we're talking about innovation performance. And what we can see is that the EU is lagging behind in terms of innovation performance after a number of global competitors. The country which performs best in our scoreboard is South Korea, followed by Canada, US, Australia, and EU comes only after. On the positive side, the improvements in EU performance over past 8 years have been quite substantial. So the EU on average improved by some 10%, and this pace of improvement is faster than in most of our world competitors, with the exception of China. So as a result of that, we have closed part of the performance gap vis-a-vis, for example, South Korea or the US. And we actually, in terms of level, we have gotten ahead of Japan. right? But there is still quite a bit of scope for improvement. Now let me use my last couple of minutes to look at the situation in Sweden. I've already mentioned that Sweden tops our ladder of innovators. It's more than 135% of the EU average. And also the change, its performance has been pretty fast, also some 10%, slightly or marginally faster than the EU. But what is even more interesting is to look at the different dimensions where Sweden performs well and then where it performs relatively less well. So in terms of relative strengths of the Swedish economy, we see that Sweden is very strong in terms of indicators relating to cooperation. Right, so public-private co-publications or international scientific co-publications are a real strength of Sweden. Also in terms of lifelong learning, employing ICT specialists, and also in terms of the share of high doctorate, foreign doctorate students. In terms of weaknesses, Sweden is doing relatively, and here I should stress the word relatively, less well, because when you look at the levels also of these indicators, they are only slightly below EU average. So this is something which perhaps Sweden wants to look at, but also in absolute performance, these indicators are certainly not that bad. These relate to job mobility of human resources in science and technology, resource productivity, government support for business R&D, non-R&D innovation expenditures, and also exports of medium and high-tech goods. But let me finish by stressing that this is based really on how different indicators that are included in our scoreboard, how they evolve. And in order to get a proper appreciation of the situation, additional insights are needed. And I believe that this will be the contribution of the next speaker.